National identity. One dialectical and moral standard for all? By the counterintuitive. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is only the idea. An idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea. Something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. The implicit argument of those who wish to civilize the uncivilized are based on many institutions, myths, and canons that include the religious, the racial, the anthropological, scientific, political, intellectual, and historical. Regardless of what type of culture we are addressing, the world praxis, which includes the West and the rest, is about stereotypes and discourses that frame almost every modern society and nation. The idea and concept of national culture was and still is an outcome of disciplinary traditions, Edward said, culture and imperialism. Indeed, millions of people, if not more, swear by their national culture, gastronomy, sports, festivals, music, mascots, dresses, architecture, Independence Day, topography, etc., etc. Cultures which came about as a process of colonization were eventually evicted, if not defeated, by the new dialectics of decolonization. A global transition, in terms of identity, be it India or Mexico or Algeria or Chile or Canada or China or South Africa, and many more nation-states that emerged on the world map during the last 200 years. The general worldwide proliferation of Western imperial power, 1500 CE, 1900 CE, followed by the historical experience of resistance against Western empires, languages, and racial doctrines provides the basis of everyone to achieve national identity. Edward Said explains this experience that followed decolonization and the rise of national identity as asserting the right to self-identification, however based on the institutional mechanisms, narrative tools, fiction, past myths, as well as key colonial traditions, imperial tendencies aimed at the so-called free peoples of decolonized lands. In order to create national identity, the remodeling of the global proletariat's sense of identity was indisputable, regardless of the subject and the power to narrate or to block other narratives. What then constitutes to your national identity, or mine? The grand narratives of emancipation aside for the moment, what makes a Mexican different from an Indian or a Russian or Turkish or French? What inherent myths and false dialectics influence our own making as citizens of a given nation? And what cements our devotion to so-called endemic or national traditions and identifiers? And what disastrous outcomes and global reorientation do we get from national identity? How can we define culture? From what I understand as two things foremost. First is the entirety of all practices like the arts, and that includes description, communication, and representation. These practices have a relative autonomy from the economic, social, and political realms, and that often exist in aesthetic forms, Edward said. The keystone of the above practices, as an aim, is most often pleasure. We must include the popular stock of lore and fiction about distant parts of the world and specialized knowledge practiced as learned disciplines such as ethnography, historiography, philology, sociology, literary history, anthropology, etc., etc. Aesthetic forms can be simply understood as books, songs, photos, movies, documentaries, events, parades, etc. Second, and perhaps more vital to our national identity, is culture as a concept that has to constantly refine and elevate each society's reservoir of the best that has been known, thought, and achieved. For example, Neil Armstrong and Carl Lewis are icons of American achievement, while Yuri Gagarin and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky are Russian legends. Rabindranath Tagore will always remain the first Indian, first non-European, as well as the first Asian to receive the Nobel Prize, 1913. The examples are limitless, yet as a practice and imposition, explained by British poet and theorist Matthew Arnold. Interests and practices that can altogether neutralize the ravages of a modern, aggressive, mercantile, and brutalizing urban existence within many European nations. An observation made by Matthew Arnold in 1872, yet as an imperial culture and pacifier that would proliferate across the decolonized world, albeit following the earlier imperial mechanisms administered by the new rulers of new emerging nationalities and nations. Be it social milestones or individual achievements, over time many aspects of such a globalized culture, aligned with mobilized aggression, practiced by people within a given nation or the state, leading to what fundamentally differentiates us from them. In many cases, what followed as a historic process of national identity, or call it worst degrees of xenophobia, racial discrimination and profiling, cultural garrisons, nationalism, and the enemies of open society, Karl Popper. Humanist culture, as secular indoctrination, according to Karl Popper, was a European tradition which had carried over from Plato to Hegel to Marx. Or on a lighter note, just imagine the culture and practices of football hooligans from England or die-hard cricket fans from India and Pakistan. Identity, culture, aggression, and combat become synonymous within the given subject, regardless of their nativity, place, game, or nation. And quote, attainable valor via nationality, end quote, Karl Popper. Culture, and its corresponding national identity that frames the above reality, also achieves mass mobilization and call to action. In many cases, it is clearly combative and most often alpha macho, patriarchy. Yet this story is not going to underpin the narrative with neo-Nazis of the West or the religious terror cells based in the East as the torchbearers of national identity. Even within seemingly independent nations with nationalist tendencies, there are many overlapping territories. The rulers and that of the distant ruled, and in turn each creates many interpretations of their common history with its own perspective, historical sense, emotions, rituals, and traditions. With the passing of time, one side cannot manifest nor distinguish its native perspective without the other, the distant and the ruler, culture and imperialism. While the cinematic projection of Superman or Rambo are supposed to be about the restoration of civilization and Western democracy, equally ethnofanatic or nativist are the projections of emancipation and achievement by the Chinese, Russians, Indians, Indonesians, Israelis, North and South Koreans, etc. Yet this is not an argument against the Olympics. What actually adds up in a globalized world, in terms of rigorous moral and intellectual codes, are policies of protecting the interests of native-born against those of the immigrants and outsiders. While there can be thousands of practices based around national identity for fun and communal joy, in many cases, the above praxis has steadily deformed into fascism, racism, supremacy, and even protectionism. Forces and characters that have effectively destroyed the actual cultural heritage and foundations of the given nations. Given that the colonial age is long gone, yet colonial ideology and class consciousness is firmly entrenched in many decolonized nations, as well as so-called liberal democracies. In his book, The Myth of the Lazy Native, writer and academic Syed Ali Alatas unpacked the mechanisms and history of British Orientalism in Malaysia. The book explains in depth how the natives of Malaysia, as well as those of Dutch East Indies, had to be integrated into colonial capitalism by uplifting the native population to become citizens of the British Empire. Syed Ali Alatas provides the direct link between imperial pacification of potentially rebellious native populations and the formation of the modern Malaysian identity, following the political philosophy of colonialism in the Asian setting. But the native Malaysian, or for that matter all the societies of the entire South Asian world, were not lazy, nor were they in any particular need of false consciousness in the form of indoctrination, Western education, knowledge formation, regulated and administered by the British and later by the Malaysian ruling class. Masks of Conquest, Oxford Press, by Gauri Vishwanathan is a deep dive about the making of modern India and modern Indians via colonial institution, practices, and the prevailing ideologies of the English upon newly colonized people of the subcontinent, who yet did not recognize themselves as Indians. The identification and pacification came in the form of administration, education, division of class, and economic hierarchies. There can be no doubts about the racist and supremacist tendencies of British colonizers in India. Early on, in the words of J. Farish, interim governor of Bombay 1838-40. The natives must either be kept down by our power, or better, they willingly submit from a conviction that we are more wise, more just, more humane, and more anxious to improve their condition than any other rulers they could possibly have. Ironic or chilling is the synchronicity of such European understanding when we read a very similar verdict in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as an idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Yet Conrad was not a solitary Occidental writer who imagined the darkest corners of Africa exposed by Europeans as a site of encounter between the savage and the civilized. The writer happens to be just one precursor of the Western views of the Third World. Several novelists as different as Graham Greene vs. Naipaul, Alain Fournier, Salman Rushdie, and Robert Stone, even Karl Marx or a famous theoretician of imperialism like Hannah Arendt. All have concurred that imperialism was doomed by its own pretentious and impossible ambitions. Yet they also return to an Eurocentric opinion, that without Western civilization the world would most probably return to a state of barbarism and destruction of secular values and laws. The same Eurocentric legacy that is carried on by Samuel Huntington, Slavoj Žižek, Jürgen Habermas, and various other influential figures of the left intelligentsia. In his book Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said literally rips the mask off our so-called multicultural world, with the intent to show that Eurocentric and later American understanding of entire humanity is still very much at the foundations of many nations in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, South America, and elsewhere. According to Edward Said, in context of 19th century transformation, when most European thinkers celebrated humanity or culture, they were principally celebrating ideas and values they ascribed to their own national culture, or to Europe, as distinct from the Orient, Africa, and even the Americas, as if other literature, art, music, crafts, and in general societies had either an inferior or a transcended value. Whatever transcended value imposed by the Europeans aside for the moment, one can better understand the humanistic tendencies of a totalitarian culture in the history of education. To be specific, British India, 1800 to 1947, is a remarkable example of how millions of people, and especially the ruling class, upper castes, would be subject to British shaping of character or the development of the aesthetic sense, morals, civic duties, obedience to law, and right down to the disciplines of ethical thinking. Masks of conquest. From this British development of India would emerge various leaders and nationalist icons, who would eventually take up the administration of the nation, once the British left in 1947. No wonder, even today certain upper-class Indians refer slum dwellers, rural folks, the lower castes and nomads of their own country as natives and Gawar, illiterate, and Verni, vernacular. Post-independence, public schools, colleges, and institutions of higher learning in India follow the same tendency and culture, based on hierarchy and, as Antonio Gramsci wrote long back, as the supremacy of one social group manifests itself in two ways, firstly as the domination, and then by intellectual and moral leadership. Modern India's culture and so-called national identity cannot be delinked from its colonial past and imposition, nor can it be acknowledged as democratic. The national identity has come about as mass mobilization of people with the idea of a new nation with new opportunity. Obviously, such lofty ideas cannot be actualized without widespread violence, displacement, loss, as well as an active economy of indoctrination orchestrated by upper caste India. Arundhati Roy, Indian author and activist. Following such a social trajectory, the question of independence, from the British willy-nilly, is connected to evolution of ultra-conservative nationalism within the same subcontinent. Not much can be said about Pakistan and Bangladesh in terms of national identity, that came about as a consequence of disastrous partitions inflicted by the British and ruling elite of the same densely populated subcontinent. One that nests over 1 billion people, speaking roughly 840 dialects, over 30 official languages, hundreds of thousands of distinct cultural practices and native peculiarities. By no means the national identity of India can be simply framed as part of the world's largest democracy, not without recognizing that Indian society is also the world's oldest surviving apartheid, Hindu caste system. And they wish to bundle all that into one moral code and one national identity, something that can actualize, at best with a flag or a currency note or police uniform or colonial military insignias. The image of the vast Arab world created by Western imperialism remains haunting and strangely attractive, and something that is most visible within Hollywood and its myths about Arabs for a very long time now. Samson and Delilah, 1949, Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, The Message, 1976, Omar Mukhtar, Lion of the Desert, 1981, Live from Baghdad, 2002, and even today as Bilal, A New Breed of Hero, 2015. The above examples cannot encompass the entirety of Orientalism that Western thinkers, historians, storytellers, and movie makers have practiced as part of the dominant culture for over 200 years. Regardless, several Arab scholars have concurred the above as most often premised upon the subordination and victimization of the native, consequently the need for emancipation of Arabs from their own faith and primitive ways. Specific to the question of Arab identity, the Western logic was imperial while the culture turned humanist, yet both worked in tandem as the understanding and treatment of the Arab by the West into a set of simple binaries. Universal clichés, roles, visuals, and even music and costumes, Jacques Burke. In Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, one gets a clear blueprint of the hierarchy of races instilled by European colonialism and how such indoctrination evolved into a set of contradictions that framed the colonized reality of the black psyche in a white world. Was it any different for the Arab, or the Jew, or the Indian? According to Fanon, true decolonization cannot be limited to a national movement. Rather, the struggle is about a psychopathology of colonization. Simply put, how colonized people can frame false identities for themselves based on the education, ethics, and aspirations of people who colonized their land and minds in the first place. This is absolutely true when we see the emerging leaders of nations like Egypt, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, the island states of the Caribbean, and nations in Africa. The modernization of Egypt by the French and later by the British, 1790 to 1940, offers a great example of laying down the seeds of national identity, while excluding or uprooting the erstwhile non-binaries and multi-ethnic complexities. The period when historians, orchestras, composers, singers, musicians, dancers, and later photographers, filmmakers, architects, and writers from Europe flooded Cairo and Alexandria, early 1800-1970s. By all means, the added benefit of such cultural colonization was also to convince foreign investors with visible evidence of their capital not just being utilized to subjugate, enslave, and imprison the natives, but also to pacify, educate, modernize, and liberate them. Culture and imperialism, Edward said. But of course the natives could not really be made to disappear, nor could they all be converted into ready subjects of modernity, and in turn they natives encroached more and more on the imperial consciousness. The evolution of national identity of Arab nations has a direct relationship to the West's earlier wonderful overall aim to eliminate slavery, religious dogma, and despotism in the erstwhile Ottoman Empire. Edward said, Algerian nationalism's long and bloody resistance against the French occupation is well documented, and is very much a part of the above evolution of Arab identity. Rebellions against European imperialism that had long started throughout the Arab-speaking world, in the Kingdom of Hijaz, 1916, Egypt, 1923, Lebanon, 1943, Libya, 1951, Tunisia, 1952, Iraq, 1958, Morocco, 1961, United Arab Republic, Old Syria, 1962, and several other regions defined abstractly on maps that lay on the crossroads of the colonial, tribal, and autonomous. Over time, Arab nationalist energy failed to unite and deliver the much-touted emancipation for the common people of this vast decolonized region. By all means, the United States and its principal allies continued their imperial presence in the Middle East and the Arab-speaking world, via hundreds of interventions, many military operations, plus hundreds of oil fields, ports, garrisons, projects known and unknown. On the other hand, various Arab nationalities would step back into rigorous codes of intellectual and moral behavior that are clearly opposed to the permissiveness associated with the West, such relatively liberal philosophies as multiculturalism, feminism, neoliberalism, and hybridity. Culture and imperialism. This occurred in democracies and monarchies alike, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and even countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. To be clear, within the formerly colonized Arab world, these, in quote, national identities would converge upon religion as a return, end quote, that have produced varieties of religious as well as nationalist fundamentalism. Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Salafi revivalist, or how Iran by religious decree limits the number of recognized non-Islamic religions to 3 Zoroastrians, Jews and Christians. No less destructive and tragic is the fate of Arab people when their leaders are systematically deposed by Western imperialism, as well as infighting between sectarian factions. Deposed Arab leaders like Anwar Sadat, 1981, Yasser Arafat, 2004, Saddam Hussein, 2006, Muammar Gaddafi, 2011, Hosni al-Sayed Mubarak, 2020, and recently Bashar al-Assad, can be taken as a record of the tenacious entanglement of nationalism and imaginary valor, leading to assassinations, coups, invasions, and long bloody wars. For all the Arab identity or pan-Arab nationalism, they have entirely failed to protect the weakest. The Iraqis, Libyans, Syrians, Kurds, Lebanese, and Palestinians. A miserable failure, as well as complicity of various Arab regimes in the ongoing genocide and mass starvation in Gaza. To round off, let's go back to the time of independence of your nation or mine, of the Latin Americans or the Arabs or whichever national identity one may use as an identifier. According to Gauri Vishwanathan, the freedom of the colonies was compared to that of a convict, both needed after care. The nurse was of course his former jailer. Yet that was explicit about the interest he was upholding. If the granting of independence was essential for the survival of Western civilization, then it should be assumed that it was possible. The general ideology of late colonialism, which did after all recognize the need to improve native welfare and for the eventual independence of a given country, but only after a certain amount of training, preparation, and general oversight. Once a supposed country is there, according to the favored ideology, people within the enclosure of the nation can attain national emancipation and identity. Masks of Conquest, Gauri Vishwanathan. To put it simply, above historic process has been a disaster for most people who do not fit or wish to conclude their identification within the fervor of nationalism, ethnocentric pride, racial superiority, and whatever set of unachievable promises based on national identity. Globally speaking, the problem of representation remains as it was 100 years ago. But one must add an applause for the national animal, national bird, national anthem, and the national morals of the Founding Fathers. What national identity sidelines is a primary need, to attain a reasonable minimum in respect of human well-being and economic security for all. Never mind the lack of diversity, multiculturalism, humanism, and open society, as emancipated by certain great visionaries of many nations for what seems like eons. The infinite commingling of nations, generation of ideas and contradictions, conflicting zones of ideology and interests, drawn together as the human experience and its knowledge. Goethe on Weltliteratur. But there is no one single intellectual state as the true bond or goal of the modern world. I personally do not care about my national identity and prefer a frontier without race or the unity of everything that is human. Whatever nation, however big or small, new or old, colonized or colonizer, cannot provide the entire spiritual or dialectical order that is available to all human beings and not caged in or recolonized by renewed myths of identity. Like we reinterpret nature for our own survival, we are also compelled to reinterpret every society, native or foreign, past or present, powerful or weak, whatever language or skin color, in order to ensure real political and cultural freedom, unlike this world of us and them. To pledge support with a paid subscription, click here.